The saddest women in the world are not the ones standing alone in the rain. They're the ones standing beside a man who no longer sees them. The rain hit the glass walls of the Callaway Grand Hotel like handfuls of silver nails falling from the Sydney sky. Outside, traffic crawled through wet streets glowing red and gold beneath neon reflections, while inside the marble lobby smelled faintly of fresh lilies, polished cedar, and expensive perfume. Claire Whitmore stepped through the revolving doors slowly, her cream-colored heels tapping against the stone floor as drops of rain slid down her long blonde hair and onto the sleeves of her coat. Every head in the lobby turned toward her for half a second, not because she was loud, not because she demanded attention, but because some women carried sadness so elegantly it became impossible not to notice. Ethan Callaway walked 3 steps ahead of her, one hand in the pocket of his charcoal wool coat, while his phone buzzed non-stop against his palm. Tall, broad shoulders, calm expression, the kind of man who looked expensive even in silence. Hotel managers straightened immediately the moment they saw him crossing the lobby. Staff lowered their voices. One young receptionist nearly dropped a stack of room key cards. Ethan didn't notice any of it anymore. Power had become background noise in his life. "Mr. Callaway," the hotel manager said nervously as he approached. "The penthouse suite has been prepared exactly as requested." Ethan gave a short nod without stopping. "Good." Claire followed behind quietly, wrapping her arms slightly tighter around herself as cold rainwater clung to her skin beneath her coat. She glanced around the lobby. Crystal chandeliers, gold-trimmed elevators, piano music drifting softly from the cocktail lounge nearby. Everything looked beautiful, untouchable, like a life designed for people who never had to worry about bills or loneliness or whether someone still loved them. 2 women sitting near the fireplace looked at Claire, then at Ethan, before exchanging a small smile with each other. Claire knew that smile. Every beautiful woman dating a wealthy man knew that smile. She lowered her eyes. Immediately, Ethan finally looked back at her. "You're freezing." His voice was calm, controlled. He removed his coat and placed it over her shoulders before she could answer. The fabric still carried the warmth of his body. "Thanks," she whispered softly. "You should have brought the umbrella I told you to bring." Claire forced a tiny smile. "I didn't think the rain would get this bad. Sydney weather always gets worse at night." He said it casually, like a businessman commenting on stock prices. Not cruel, not cold exactly, just distant. That was the problem. Ethan Callaway had mastered the art of taking care of people without emotionally touching them anymore. A bellhop approached carefully. "Good evening, sir." Ethan handed him the car keys. "Bring the luggage upstairs." "Of course, sir." Claire noticed the young bellhop glance at her briefly before looking away. Not judgmental, curious, as if trying to figure out whether she was another temporary woman in a billionaire's life. She hated that feeling. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Ethan stepped inside first. Claire followed. The doors closed behind them, shutting out the piano music and lobby chatter instantly. Silence settled between them. Only the hum of the elevator remained. Ethan checked another message on his phone. His jaw tightened slightly. "Everything okay?" Claire asked carefully. "Just work. It's nearly 10 o'clock. The Singapore deal closes tomorrow morning." Claire nodded, even though disappointment flickered briefly across her face. Ethan didn't notice. Or maybe he did, and simply didn't know how to respond anymore. The elevator climbed higher through the tower. 30 floors. 40. 50. Sydney's rain-covered skyline slowly expanded outside the glass walls beside them. Claire stared at the city lights below. Somewhere out, there were ordinary couples eating takeaway on couches, arguing over movies, laughing about stupid things. Meanwhile, she was floating 50 stories above the harbor with a man who could buy almost anything in the world except peace inside his own chest. "You've been quiet tonight," Ethan finally said. "Have I?" Claire. She looked at him then. Really. Looked at him. The sharp jawline. The tired eyes hidden behind confidence. The tiny tension in his shoulders that never disappeared anymore. Sometimes she wondered if he even remembered how to relax. "I'm just tired," she said softly. Ethan stepped closer, brushing rain-damp hair gently behind her ear. The gesture was affectionate, familiar, perfect from the outside, but somehow it made her chest ache instead of comfort her. Because even tenderness could feel lonely when it arrived automatically. "Dinner's waiting upstairs," he said. "I had them prepare your favorite wine." Claire smiled politely again. That's sweet. Sweet. Not intimate. Not warm. The elevator reached the penthouse level with a soft ding. As the doors opened, the private hallway glowed beneath dim golden lights and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Sydney Harbor. Rain streaked the glass like tears sliding down a mirror. A staff member opened the penthouse doors immediately. "Welcome back, Mr. Calloway." Ethan nodded once. "Thank you." Claire stepped inside slowly. The suite was enormous. Soft jazz music played quietly from hidden speakers. Candles flickered beside the dining table near the windows. Roses rested in crystal vases across the room. Everything looked breathtaking. Everything looked prepared, planned, controlled. Claire suddenly realized something terrifying in that moment. Ethan knew exactly how to create romance. He just no longer knew how to feel it. Her eyes drifted toward the rain outside again. Somewhere beneath those storm clouds, the city kept moving without them. People rushing home. People falling in love. People getting their hearts broken. And for the first time since she met Ethan Calloway, Claire Whitmore felt strangely trapped inside a beautiful life that no longer felt alive. People only notice luxury from the outside. They never notice how cold it feels once the doors close behind you. Claire stood alone beside the floor-to-ceiling windows while rain rolled down the glass in slow silver streams, blurring the lights of Sydney Harbor into soft streaks of gold and blue. Somewhere below, ferries moved quietly through the dark water while traffic crawled across the harbor bridge beneath the storm. The penthouse was warm, beautiful, perfectly silent except for distant jazz music and the soft crackling of a fireplace near the dining table. Yet Claire had never felt more alone in her life. Behind her, Ethan loosened the cuffs of his shirt while speaking quietly into his phone near the kitchen island. His voice remained calm and measured, the same tone he used in interviews, board meetings, and investor calls. "Move the Singapore conference to Thursday morning." A pause. "No, I do not care what Harrison thinks." "Fix it." Claire closed her eyes briefly. Even his stress sounded expensive. She glanced toward the dining table prepared beside the windows. Candles flickered gently beside crystal glasses and plates decorated with tiny edible flowers she could barely pronounce. Ethan always remembered details like that. Her favorite wine, her favorite desserts, the exact temperature she liked the room kept at during winter. He remembered everything except the one thing she needed most lately. Presence. Real presence. Not attention purchased through perfection. Not affection squeezed between business calls. She slowly removed his coat from her shoulders and folded it carefully over the back of a chair. The fabric smelled faintly of cedarwood cologne and rainwater. Once, that scent alone could calm her heart. Tonight it only reminded her how far away he felt standing less than 20 feet from her. Ethan ended the call and finally looked up. "Dinner will get cold." Claire turned toward him with a soft smile that did not fully reach her eyes. "It already looks too beautiful to eat." Ethan walked toward the table and pulled out her chair automatically. Gentleman habits. Controlled habits. Everything polished to perfection. Claire sat down quietly while he poured wine into her glass. Deep red reflections shimmered beneath candlelight. "You barely touched lunch today," Ethan said. "You should eat something." "I was busy." "With what?" She hesitated for half a second. "Life." Ethan looked at her for a moment as if trying to understand whether she was joking. Then his phone buzzed again across the table. Claire stared at it. So did he. The screen lit up with another email notification. Ethan reached for the phone instinctively before stopping himself halfway. Claire noticed the movement immediately. That hurt more than if he had answered it, because it meant his mind had already left the room. "You can take it," she said softly. "It is probably important. You are important." The words arrived quickly, smoothly, like something he believed should fix the moment instantly. Claire lowered her eyes toward her wine glass. That sounded rehearsed. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. "What is that supposed to mean?" "Nothing." "Claire." She gave a tiny shrug. "You say all the right things lately. That is the problem." Rain tapped harder against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled softly across the harbor. Ethan studied her face carefully now, finally sensing the emotional distance between them growing too large to ignore. "You have been upset for weeks." "I am not upset." "Then what are you?" Claire looked toward the city lights again before answering. "Tired of competing with your world." Ethan frowned slightly. "You are not competing with anything." She almost laughed at that. Almost. "Ethan, your assistant knows your schedule better than I do." Your investors hear your voice more than I do. Sometimes I sit beside you for an hour and realize you never actually heard a single thing I said. That is not fair. I know. Her voice remained gentle. That somehow made it worse. You are trying. I can see that. Ethan leaned forward slowly. Then why does it feel like you are slipping away from me? The question lingered heavily between them. Claire swallowed quietly, because she did not know how to explain something so painful without sounding ungrateful. Ethan had never cheated on her, never humiliated her, never raised his voice at her. He protected her, spoiled her, supported her career. From the outside, every woman in Sydney probably envied her life. But loneliness hidden inside luxury still felt like loneliness. Claire stared down at the candle flickering between them. Do you know what I miss most? She asked softly. Ethan waited. The old apartment. He blinked in surprise. The apartment in Paddington? She nodded. The tiny kitchen with the broken cabinet door. Ethan looked confused now. Claire, that place was awful. No, a sad smile touched her lips. It was small. There is a difference. She looked up at him finally. You used to come home exhausted and still sit on the kitchen counter while I made pasta at midnight. You used to laugh more. Ethan stayed silent. Claire continued quietly. Back then you looked at me like I was part of your life. Her voice dropped softer. Now I feel like I am just scheduled into it. Something changed in Ethan's expression then. Small, almost invisible, but real, like a crack appearing beneath polished glass. He leaned back slowly, rubbing one hand across his jaw while thunder echoed outside again. I built all of this for us, he said quietly. Claire nodded immediately. I know you did. Everything I do is for our future. I know that too. Then why does it sound like you resent me for it? Claire looked at him carefully for several seconds before answering. Because somewhere along the way, her voice nearly broke. You started managing me instead of loving me. Silence flooded the room instantly. Heavy silence. The kind that made even rain sound louder. Ethan froze completely. Claire immediately regretted saying it out loud. She saw the impact hit him behind his eyes. Not anger. Something sadder. Recognition. Ethan slowly lowered his gaze toward the untouched dinner between them. For the first time that night, the powerful CEO sitting across from her no longer looked untouchable. He looked tired, human, and strangely lost. Some relationships do not fall apart all at once. They fade quietly inside beautiful rooms where nobody can hear the silence growing between two people. Ethan stayed seated at the dining table long after Claire's words settled into the room like smoke after a fire. The candles continued flickering softly between them while rain moved across the glass walls in restless waves. Claire could see him thinking now. Really thinking. Not as a businessman calculating outcomes. As a man trying to understand how the woman he loved could feel lonely while sitting beside him in a $20 million penthouse overlooking Sydney Harbor. Ethan finally exhaled slowly and loosened the collar of his shirt another inch. I did not realize things had gotten this bad. Claire looked down at her untouched dinner. That is because you only notice problems once they become emergencies. He leaned back in silence. Somewhere in the suite, the jazz playlist shifted into a slower piano melody that made the room feel even heavier somehow. Ethan stared toward the windows for several seconds before speaking again. You think I control everything because I do not trust you. Claire looked at him carefully. No, her voice stayed gentle. I think you control everything because you are afraid. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Not angry. Exposed. She had known him long enough to recognize the difference. Outside, lightning flashed somewhere beyond the harbor, briefly illuminating the rain-covered skyline in silver light. Ethan stood up from the table and walked toward the windows slowly, sliding one hand into his pocket while the other rested against his hip. Tall. Still. Controlled even now. Claire watched his reflection in the glass instead of his face. You know what people say about me? He asked quietly. That you built one of the fastest-growing luxury hotel groups in the country before 35. No, a faint humorless smile crossed his face. They say I never lose control. Claire stayed silent. Ethan stared out at the storm below. Investors trust me because I stay calm under pressure. Staff trust me because I always have answers. The media likes me because I never embarrass myself in public. He paused briefly. Everything in my life depends on control. Claire slowly rose from her chair and walked toward him. The city lights reflected softly across her pale skin and damp blonde hair. But love is not a business deal, Ethan. He closed his eyes for half a second at that sentence, like it physically exhausted him to hear it. You think I do not love you enough? No. She stood beside him now, arms folded lightly against herself. I think you are terrified of loving someone naturally because natural things can leave. Ethan swallowed once. Hard. The silence after that felt enormous. Claire suddenly remembered the first time she met him almost 3 years earlier at a charity event in Melbourne. Everyone else in the room had tried too hard to impress him. Ethan had barely spoken all evening, standing near the balcony with one hand in his pocket while pretending not to hate social events. She remembered offering him half her dessert because he looked miserable. He had laughed then. Actually laughed. Soft and genuine. She had not heard that version of him in months. Do you remember the beach house in Byron Bay? She asked quietly. Ethan glanced at her. The weekend after your first magazine campaign? She nodded slowly. The power went out because of that storm. A tiny smile almost appeared in Ethan's eyes. You burned the garlic bread. Because you distracted me. You were singing loudly in the kitchen. Claire looked down with a sad smile. You danced with me anyway. The memory lingered painfully between them. Ethan turned back toward the rain outside. Things were simpler then. Claire studied him carefully before answering. No, you were softer then. That one landed deeper than the others. She saw it immediately in the way his shoulders stiffened slightly beneath the dark fabric of his shirt. Ethan Calloway could negotiate billion-dollar contracts without blinking. But emotional honesty still unsettled him like a storm he could not predict. His phone buzzed again across the dining table behind them. Neither of them moved toward it this time. Claire looked at the reflection of the skyline shimmering across the windows. Do you know what scares me most? She whispered. Ethan looked at her quietly. One day I am going to stop missing you. The words hit harder than anger ever could have. Ethan turned fully toward her now, real concern finally breaking through his composure. Claire, I still love you. Her eyes glistened slightly beneath the warm lights of the suite. That is why this hurts so much. Ethan stepped closer instinctively. You are not losing me. Claire looked at him with heartbreaking softness. Then why do I feel invisible standing beside you lately? He opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. Because somewhere deep down, Ethan already knew she was right. He had become excellent at providing everything except emotional closeness. The expensive trips, the penthouses, the gifts, the security. He kept building larger walls around the people he loved, believing protection and control were the same thing. Claire slowly brushed damp hair behind one ear and looked toward the elevators near the entrance of the suite. I think I need some air. Ethan frowned immediately. In this weather? I am not leaving the hotel. Claire. His voice softened now. It is almost midnight. She offered a tired smile. I just need a few minutes away from all this. Ethan looked around the penthouse as if seeing it properly for the first time tonight. The candles, the luxury furniture, the flawless view. Suddenly none of it looked comforting anymore. It looked cold. Claire reached for her coat quietly from the chair near the dining table. Ethan watched her every movement carefully now, something unsettled growing behind his eyes. I can come with you, he said. Claire shook her head gently. That is the problem. He blinked slightly. What does that mean? She hesitated before answering softly. Sometimes I feel like you are always beside me physically. Her voice nearly disappeared. But emotionally, I am standing alone. Ethan stared at her silently as thunder rolled again across the harbor. For the first time in years, the powerful man who controlled entire hotels suddenly looked completely helpless watching one woman walk toward the door. The most dangerous moment in a relationship is not the screaming. It is the quiet second when one person realizes they can walk away without being stopped. Claire reached the penthouse door slowly while the storm outside deepened across Sydney Harbor. Rain hammered against the windows hard enough to blur the skyline completely now, turning the city into nothing but distant glowing shapes beneath the dark sky. Ethan remained near the windows behind her, watching silently as she slipped her arms back into her coat. For the first time in years, he looked unsure of himself inside his own hotel. Claire. His voice was lower now, softer. She paused, but did not turn around immediately. Do not leave angry. A sad smile touched her lips at those words. You still think this is about anger? She faced him then, her blue eyes tired beneath the warm penthouse lights. I am exhausted, Ethan. There is a difference. He stepped toward her carefully. Not as a billionaire. Not as the owner of the building. just as a man trying to hold on to something slipping through his hands. Tell me what you need me to do. Claire stared at him for several seconds because she could hear the sincerity in his voice. That almost made it harder. I do not want you to manage this conversation like a problem at work. I am trying to understand. No, she shook her head gently. You are trying to fix it immediately because you cannot tolerate feeling helpless. The truth landed heavily between them again. Ethan looked away first. Outside, thunder rolled through the city so loudly that even the glass walls vibrated faintly. Claire exhaled slowly. I just need 10 minutes alone. Ethan glanced toward the hallway beyond the penthouse doors. At least let security go with you. Claire almost laughed softly from disbelief. See? What? You still do it. Do what? Control everything. Ethan rubbed one hand across his face in frustration before answering. It is nearly midnight during a storm. You are walking alone through a hotel I own. I am not trying to control you. I am trying to protect you. Claire looked at him quietly. Sometimes those are the same thing. Before Ethan could answer, the lights flickered suddenly overhead. Once. Twice. The jazz music cut out for half a second before returning again. Both of them instinctively glanced upward. Probably weather interference, Ethan said automatically. Somewhere deeper in the hotel, a faint mechanical hum echoed through the walls. Claire looked uneasy suddenly. I really hate storms. Ethan noticed the shift in her expression immediately. You are safe here. She nodded softly, even though her fingers tightened around the strap of her handbag. Another flicker of lights swept through the penthouse. This time longer. The windows briefly reflected. Complete darkness before emergency systems restored power again. Ethan frowned now. That should not happen. His phone buzzed instantly. He answered without hesitation this time. What is going on? The engineering manager's nervous voice crackled through the speaker. Sir, the storm has damaged part of the lower electrical system. Backup generators are online, but some lifts are temporarily offline. Ethan's expression hardened immediately into business mode. How long? We are assessing now. I want updates every 5 minutes. Yes, sir. He ended the call and looked at Claire. It is under control. Claire gave a tiny nod, but she already looked unsettled by the flickering lights and distant thunder. Ethan noticed. You can stay here until the storm settles. She hesitated, then quietly shook her head. I still need air. Ethan looked exhausted suddenly. Emotionally exhausted. Like every answer he gave tonight somehow pushed her further away. Fine, he said quietly. I will walk with you downstairs. Ethan, I am not arguing anymore. His voice remained calm, but firm. I am just not letting you wander around alone during an electrical issue. Claire studied him carefully before finally nodding once. The tension between them remained fragile as they stepped out into the private hallway together. The corridor outside the penthouse felt strangely empty and silent compared to earlier. Soft golden lights glowed along the walls while rain battered the enormous windows overlooking the harbor below. Ethan pressed the elevator button. Nothing happened. He pressed it again. Still nothing. Great, he muttered quietly. Claire folded her arms against herself as thunder echoed again. Maybe I should just take the stairs. 52 floors? Ethan gave her a faint look. Absolutely not. Finally, after several long seconds, the elevator doors slid open with a mechanical groan. The lights inside flickered dimly. Claire hesitated immediately. Ethan noticed. It is fine. It does not look fine. Claire. His voice softened again. Trust me. She looked at him strangely after that sentence. Not angry. Just sad. That is not the problem. Ethan held the elevator doors open while she stepped inside quietly beside him. The mirrored walls reflected both of them standing there in silence. Beautiful couple. Expensive clothes. Perfect image. Yet the emotional distance between them felt enormous inside the small space. The elevator doors closed slowly. For a moment, neither spoke. The lift began descending through the tower with a low mechanical hum beneath their feet. 49 floors. 48. Rainwater streaked across the glass panel beside them, while flashes of lightning illuminated the city outside in brief silver bursts. Claire leaned lightly against the wall, breathing slower now. Ethan watched her carefully. Are you all right? I just hate small spaces during storms. Since when? She hesitated. Since I was 14. Ethan frowned slightly. You never told me that. Claire looked down. You never asked. The sentence hit harder than she intended. Ethan opened his mouth to respond just as the elevator jerked violently beneath them. The lights instantly went out. Claire gasped softly as complete darkness swallowed the lift. Then everything stopped. Darkness has a strange way of forcing people to face the things they spend their whole lives avoiding. For one long second after the elevator stopped, neither of them moved. The only sound inside the lift was the distant storm growling through the building and Claire's breathing suddenly turning uneven beside him. Then emergency lights flickered faintly near the ceiling, casting the small elevator in a dim amber glow that made everything feel unreal. Ethan immediately pressed the emergency button panel. Nothing happened. He pressed it again harder. Still nothing. Damn it. Claire stayed frozen against the mirrored wall, her fingers gripping the strap of her handbag tightly enough to whiten her knuckles. Ethan noticed instantly. Hey. His voice softened. Look at me. She tried. But another violent crack of thunder rolled through the tower, followed by a low mechanical groan somewhere above them. Claire's breathing became faster immediately. Ethan stepped toward her carefully. The backup systems will reset soon. She nodded too quickly. Okay. But she did not sound okay. Not even close. Ethan pulled out his phone. No signal. The storm had disrupted the internal network systems. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm because panic solved nothing. That had always been his philosophy. Stay calm. Stay in control. Fix the problem. Yet standing inside a stalled elevator with Claire trembling beside him suddenly felt different from every crisis he had handled before. This one mattered emotionally, which meant he could not control it the same way. Claire. He kept his voice low and steady. You need to breathe slower. She shut her eyes tightly for a second. I am trying. Her voice came out thin and shaky. Ethan had seen investors panic during market crashes. He had seen executives break down under pressure. But seeing Claire afraid unsettled him in a way he was completely unprepared for. He moved closer slowly. You are safe. Claire suddenly shook her head. I hate this. The elevator? Being trapped. Her breathing grew faster again. Ethan watched the panic rising in her face now. Pale skin, trembling hands, eyes glassy with fear she was trying desperately to hide. Claire. He gently touched her arm. Talk to me. Another flash of lightning briefly illuminated the small glass panel above the elevator doors before darkness swallowed it again. Claire flinched hard enough for Ethan to notice immediately. Hey. His voice lowered further, softer now than she had heard all night. Stay with me. She looked at him finally. Really looked at him. And for the first time that evening, Ethan saw something beyond sadness inside her eyes. Fear. Real fear. When I was 14, she whispered unevenly, my mom locked me inside a storage room during a storm. Ethan froze slightly. Claire swallowed hard before continuing. She and my stepfather were screaming at each other downstairs, and I tried to stop them. Her voice trembled harder now. So he dragged me into this tiny room and left me there for hours. Ethan stared at her silently. She had never told him this story before. Not once in 3 years. Claire wrapped her arms tightly around herself as if trying to physically hold herself together. There were no windows. The lights went out because of the storm, and her breath hitched painfully. I remember hearing thunder and thinking nobody was coming back for me. Ethan felt something sharp twist inside his chest. Suddenly, the elevator no longer felt small because of the walls around them. It felt small because of how close her pain suddenly was. Claire, I know it sounds stupid. No, his voice became firmer immediately. It does not. She looked away quickly, embarrassed by her own vulnerability. I hate that this still affects me. Ethan washed her shaking hands carefully before quietly removing his suit jacket. He folded it once and placed it gently around her shoulders. Claire looked surprised by the tenderness of the gesture. You are cold, he said softly. She almost laughed weakly through her panic. I am terrified. Ethan stepped closer until only inches separated them. Not possessive, not controlling, just present. Fully present for the first time in months. Then I am staying right here. Claire looked at him silently while rain hammered against the tower outside. The dim emergency light softened the sharp edges of Ethan's face now. Without the penthouse, without the meetings, without the phone calls, he suddenly looked less like a billionaire and more like the exhausted man underneath everything. Ethan slowly slid down against the elevator wall until he was sitting on the floor. Then he looked up at her. Sit with me. Claire hesitated briefly before lowering herself beside him. The elevator suddenly felt quieter now. Smaller. More honest somehow. Ethan loosened the top buttons of his shirt slightly and leaned his head back against the mirrored wall. You know what is ironic? He said quietly. Claire looked at him. I spend my whole life building hotels designed to make people feel safe. A faint sad smile crossed his face. And somehow the person I love feels alone standing next to me. Claire looked down at her hands. I never wanted to hurt you tonight. You did not. Ethan stared ahead quietly. You told me the truth. Another silence settled between them, but this one felt different from earlier. Less cold. More fragile. Claire glanced sideways at him. Are you angry? Ethan looked genuinely surprised by the question. At you? She nodded slightly. He shook his head slowly. No, his voice became quieter. I think I am angry at myself. Claire stared at him carefully because that was not something Ethan Calloway admitted easily. Maybe ever. The storm continued raging outside, while the elevator remained frozen somewhere between floors. Yet strangely, this tiny broken space was the first place all night where neither of them could escape into distractions anymore. No meetings. No luxury. No staff. No perfectly controlled image. Just two people sitting on the floor in dim amber light, while the truth finally reached them both. People think powerful men are afraid of losing money. They are wrong. The thing that truly terrifies powerful men is the moment someone sees through them completely and stays quiet afterward. The emergency lights continued glowing faintly above the elevator ceiling while rain battered the hotel tower outside. Ethan and Claire remained seated on the floor beside each other in the dim amber light, close enough to touch, but emotionally standing on the edge of something fragile and uncertain. For once, Ethan's phone stayed silent in his pocket. No investors. No board members. No meetings demanding his attention. Just silence. Honest silence. Claire leaned her head lightly against the mirrored wall behind her, breathing calmer now than before. The panic attack had faded, but exhaustion still lingered across her face. Ethan noticed every small detail now. The tension around her eyes. The way her fingers still trembled occasionally against the sleeves of his jacket wrapped around her shoulders. The sadness she kept trying to hide politely instead of expressing openly. That realization hurt him more than he expected. Why did you never tell me about your stepfather? He asked quietly. Claire stared ahead for several seconds before answering. Because I spent most of my life trying to forget him. Ethan's jaw tightened subtly. Did he hurt you? Claire shook her head slowly. Not physically. The answer somehow felt worse. Ethan looked down briefly. He understood emotional damage. Sometimes scars nobody could see lasted the longest. Claire gave a faint, tired smile. He just had a way of making everyone in the house feel small. Ethan listened carefully now. Really listened. Everything had to happen his way. Every conversation. Every decision. Every emotion. Her eyes lowered slightly. If someone cried, he called them dramatic. If someone disagreed with him, he said they were ungrateful. Ethan stayed very still beside her. Claire let out a quiet breath. After a while you stop expressing yourself because it feels easier than being misunderstood all the time. The words settled heavily inside the small elevator. Ethan suddenly realized why tonight felt so painful. Claire was not just reacting to him ignoring her lately. She was reacting to an old wound reopening itself in a different form. He rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw, staring toward the closed elevator doors. I never wanted you to feel controlled. I know. Claire looked at him softly. That is what makes this harder. Ethan frowned slightly. What does that mean? Claire hesitated. You are not cruel, Ethan. Her voice remained calm and honest. You are kind in 1,000 practical ways. She glanced around the elevator. You protect people. You provide for people. You solve problems for everyone around you. Then her eyes met his again. But emotionally, she struggled for the right words. Sometimes loving you feels like standing outside a locked room. Ethan swallowed hard at that sentence. No investor presentation had ever made him feel this exposed before. He looked away briefly, staring at the emergency lights above them. You think I do not know how to let people in? Claire gave a tiny sad smile. I think you do not know how to need people. Silence followed immediately. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms against his knees while thunder echoed somewhere outside the building again. When my father died, he said quietly, I was 22. Claire looked at him with surprise. Ethan almost never talked about his family. The company was already drowning in debt. Everyone expected it to collapse within a year. His voice stayed calm, but distant now, like he was revisiting memories he usually kept locked away. I remember sitting in his office after the funeral while lawyers argued outside the door. He gave a faint, humorless laugh. Nobody asked whether I was grieving. They only asked whether I could save the business. Claire listened silently. Ethan stared down at his hands. So, I learned very quickly that emotions slowed people down. Vulnerability made people nervous. His expression darkened slightly. Control became survival. Claire watched him carefully because for the first time tonight, Ethan was no longer speaking like a CEO. He sounded like a tired young man who had been carrying responsibility for too long. "You built walls," she said softly. Ethan nodded once. And after a while I forgot they were even there. Rain crashed violently against the tower again, louder than before now. Somewhere deep below them, faint voices echoed through the elevator shaft as hotel staff worked to restore systems across the building. Claire slowly pulled Ethan's jacket tighter around herself. "You know what is strange?" she whispered. Ethan looked at her. "I never cared about your money." A faint smile touched his face for the first time in hours. "I know. I cared about how safe I felt with you." Her eyes softened painfully. "But lately it feels like your life has become so carefully organized that there is no space left for real emotions anymore." Ethan stared at her quietly. Claire continued softly. "You schedule dinners. You schedule holidays. You even schedule time to relax." Her voice cracked slightly. "But love cannot survive as another task on a calendar." Ethan closed his eyes briefly because every word she said felt true. Uncomfortably true. He had spent years building the perfect life while somehow starving the relationship inside it. The elevator suddenly jolted beneath them without warning. Claire instinctively grabbed Ethan's arm tightly as the lights flickered again. Ethan immediately turned toward her. "It is all right." But Claire's breathing had already quickened again. Ethan moved closer without thinking, one hand gently steadying her trembling fingers. "Hey." His voice lowered softly. "Look at me." Claire tried, focusing on him while thunder shook the building again. Ethan held her gaze carefully. Calmly. "You are not 14 anymore," he said quietly. "And you are not alone in here." Something shifted in Claire's expression then. Small. Fragile, but real. Because for the first time in months, Ethan was not trying to fix her emotions. He was simply staying beside them. Sometimes love does not begin with grand gestures. Sometimes it begins with one person finally staying still long enough to hear another person's pain. The elevator remained trapped somewhere between floors while rain continued crashing against the tower outside. The emergency lights flickered softly above Ethan and Claire, painting warm shadows across the mirrored walls around them. Time felt strange inside the small space now. Slower. More honest. Claire still held on to Ethan's hand without realizing it fully. Her breathing had steadied, but her fingers remained curled lightly around his, as if some part of her still needed proof that she was not alone. Ethan noticed every second of it. And strangely, he did not want her to let go. He sat beside her quietly, one shoulder resting against the elevator wall while thunder rolled far above the city. The powerful calm he carried in meetings and interviews was gone now. In its place was something rawer, more human. Claire slowly looked toward him. "You are quieter than usual." Ethan gave a faint smile without humor. "I think you finally said the one thing nobody else ever had the courage to say to me." Claire lowered her eyes slightly. "I was not trying to hurt you." "I know." Ethan studied the dim floor lights for a moment before continuing softly. "That almost makes it worse." Claire watched him carefully. Ethan rarely admitted emotional discomfort aloud. Most people in his world never saw beyond his composure. Investors admired him. Staff respected him. Journalists described him as disciplined, strategic, untouchable. Nobody ever asked whether carrying that image became exhausting after a while. Ethan rubbed his thumb slowly against Claire's trembling fingers without thinking about it. "When my father was alive," he said quietly, "he used to tell me, emotions made people weak." Claire stayed silent, listening carefully. He believed successful men should never appear uncertain, never emotional, never dependent on anyone. Ethan let out a slow breath. "Then after he died, I spent years proving I could survive without needing anybody." Claire's expression softened painfully. And somewhere along the way, surviving became more important than feeling. Ethan looked at her immediately because the sentence landed too accurately. "Yeah," he admitted quietly. The storm outside deepened again. Rain streaked violently against the tower while distant lightning briefly illuminated the emergency panel beside them. Claire leaned her head back against the mirrored wall. You know what is strange? Ethan glanced toward her. When we first met, I thought you were lonely. Ethan looked surprised by that. Claire smiled faintly. You were standing alone at a charity event filled with hundreds of people. She laughed softly at the memory. Every woman in the room wanted your attention, and you looked like you wanted to escape through the balcony doors. Ethan actually smiled slightly this time. A real smile. Small but genuine. I hated those events. I know. Claire's eyes softened warmly for the first time all night. That is why I brought you dessert. Ethan looked down briefly, remembering. Lemon tart. You looked miserable. I probably was. Claire smiled again, but sadness still lingered behind it. Back then you felt different. Ethan studied her face carefully. Different how? She hesitated before answering honestly. You still let people surprise you. Silence settled quietly between them after that. Ethan stared ahead while her words echoed heavily inside his chest. He remembered those early years with Claire clearly now. Small apartments. Midnight takeaway food. Long drives along the coast with no schedule and no destination. Back then success had still felt exciting instead of heavy. Somewhere along the way, he had replaced intimacy with structure because structure felt safer. Predictable. Easier to control. But sitting trapped inside this elevator, Ethan suddenly realized something painful. Claire had never needed perfection from him. She only needed access to the real person underneath the control. I think I became someone my younger self would hate, he admitted quietly. Claire turned toward him slowly. Ethan laughed once under his breath, but there was no amusement in it. 22-year-old Ethan would probably look at me now and think I sold my soul to boardrooms and hotel contracts. Claire shook her head softly. No, Ethan looked at her. I think younger you would just be tired. That sentence hit him harder than expected. Because deep down, she was right. He was tired. Tired of carrying responsibility every hour of every day. Tired of believing vulnerability automatically created weakness. Tired of standing in crowded luxury rooms feeling emotionally disconnected from everyone around him. Another sudden jolt shook the elevator slightly. Claire instinctively moved closer again, panic flashing briefly across her face before Ethan gently steadied her hand. It is okay. His voice remained calm. Present. Claire looked at him carefully, then whispered something so quietly, he almost missed it. Thank you for staying. Ethan frowned softly. Where else would I go? Her eyes glistened slightly beneath the amber light. Most people leave once things get difficult. Ethan stared at her for several long seconds after that. Because suddenly he understood something devastating. Claire had spent her whole life expecting abandonment. And lately, without realizing it, he had been emotionally abandoning her in slow motion while still standing physically beside her every day. Ethan looked down briefly before speaking again, his voice quieter now than ever before. I think I have been loving you like a man afraid of losing control instead of a man grateful to be loved. Claire's breath caught softly at the honesty in his words. Ethan turned toward her fully now. No walls. No rehearsed calm. Just truth. And I do not know when I forgot the difference. The storm rumbled heavily outside while the elevator remained suspended between floors. Yet somehow, inside the dim stillness of that broken space, something else had finally started moving again between them. There are moments in life when a person realizes the strongest walls they ever built were never around their money or success. They were around their heart. The elevator remained suspended in silence while the storm wrapped itself around the hotel tower outside like a living thing. Rain hammered endlessly against the glass structure above them, and every few minutes thunder rolled through the building deeply enough to vibrate beneath the floor. Yet inside the dim amber light of the stalled elevator, something fragile had shifted between Ethan and Claire. The distance that had haunted them for months no longer felt hidden behind polished conversations and expensive distractions. It sat openly between them now. Honest. Painful. Real. Claire slowly loosened her grip on Ethan's hand, though neither of them moved away from each other. They remained seated side by side against the mirrored wall, close enough to feel the warmth of each other's shoulders. Ethan looked exhausted in a way Claire had never seen before. Not physically, emotionally, like a man who had spent years holding his breath without realizing it. Can I ask you something? Claire whispered softly. Ethan nodded once. Anything. She looked down briefly before gathering the courage to speak. When was the last time you were actually happy? The question caught him off guard. Ethan stared ahead silently for several long seconds while rain crashed against the building above them. He looked like someone searching through old memories he had not touched in years. Finally, he let out a quiet breath. I do not know. Claire's chest tightened slightly at the honesty in his voice. Ethan rubbed his hands together slowly, staring toward the elevator doors. I remember moments, he admitted quietly. Winning contracts. Opening new hotels. Seeing my company finally become stable after years of pressure. He gave a faint, humorless smile. But those moments never lasted very long. Claire watched him carefully. Ethan continued softly. Every success just created another responsibility. Another expectation. His eyes lowered slightly. Eventually, I stopped asking myself whether I was happy. I only asked whether everything was under control. Claire felt something ache deeply inside her chest hearing that. Because suddenly she understood him in a way she had not before. Ethan had not become emotionally distant because he stopped loving her. He had become emotionally distant because somewhere along the way, survival and control had replaced vulnerability completely. That sounds lonely, she whispered. Ethan laughed quietly under his breath. It is. The honesty in that single word filled the small elevator with silence afterward. Claire looked at him carefully. Then why do you keep living that way? Ethan leaned his head back against the mirrored wall and closed his eyes briefly. Because I am good at it. The answer broke her heart more than she expected. Ethan opened his eyes again and stared at the dim ceiling lights above them. When people depend on you financially, emotionally, professionally, he swallowed slowly. You convince yourself there is no room to fall apart. Claire's expression softened. Nobody asked you to become a machine. Ethan looked at her then. Really looked at her. No, his voice lowered painfully. But everybody rewards me for acting like one. The storm outside seemed quieter for a moment after that. Or maybe they had simply stopped hearing it the same way. Claire slowly drew her knees closer against herself beneath Ethan's jacket. You know what scared me tonight? She admitted softly. Ethan frowned slightly. The elevator? She shook her head. No, her eyes met his carefully, realizing I was starting to emotionally give up on us. Ethan went completely still beside her. Claire looked down immediately after saying it aloud. I did not want that to happen. Ethan's chest tightened painfully hearing those words. He had spent months assuming their relationship was stable simply because nothing dramatic had exploded between them. No screaming. No betrayal. No scandal. Meanwhile, Claire had been quietly drowning beside him while he stayed too distracted to notice. Ethan lowered his gaze toward the floor. I thought providing everything meant I was being a good partner. Claire smiled sadly. You gave me beautiful things. Her voice softened. But sometimes, I just wanted you tired on the couch beside me asking how my day was. Ethan shut his eyes briefly because the simplicity of that nearly destroyed him. Not private jets. Not luxury hotels. Not expensive gifts. She had only wanted emotional presence. Human closeness. The kind of love that could not be scheduled into a calendar between meetings. Another soft mechanical sound echoed somewhere above them. The elevator lights flickered briefly again before stabilizing. Claire instinctively tensed, but Ethan gently touched her hand immediately. Not controlling. Comforting. I am here, he whispered. Claire looked at him silently. There was something different in his eyes now. The sharp, controlled distance she had grown used to was gone. In its place was vulnerability he no longer seemed able to hide. Ethan slowly shook his head as if struggling with his own thoughts. Do you know what scares me? Claire watched him carefully. I spent so many years trying to become someone impossible to hurt. He looked down at their hands resting beside each other. That I accidentally became someone difficult to love properly. Claire felt tears sting faintly behind her eyes at the raw honesty in his voice. Ethan gave a quiet laugh under his breath, but it sounded broken this time. And the worst part is I did not even notice it happening. Claire turned toward him fully now. Ethan. He looked at her. You are not impossible to love. Her voice trembled softly. You are just afraid of being seen when you are not perfect. Silence filled the elevator again. Heavy. Honest. Ethan stared at her like no one had ever explained him that clearly before. Because maybe nobody ever had. The storm continued raging outside, while the city carried on beneath them somewhere far below. But inside the stillness of that stalled elevator, Ethan Calloway finally understood something no amount of money or success had ever taught him before. Being loved was not the same thing as being admired. And for the first time in years, he realized he did not want Claire to admire him anymore. He just wanted her to stay. The truth about love is this. You can spend years building a perfect life with someone and still lose them quietly if you stop making them feel emotionally safe inside it. The elevator lights flickered once more before finally stabilizing into a steady amber glow. Outside, the storm still raged across Sydney, but inside the small suspended space, the silence between Ethan and Claire no longer felt cold. It felt exposed, honest in a way neither of them had allowed themselves to be for a very long time. Ethan sat beside her with his sleeves rolled slightly past his wrists now, the sharp polished image he carried everywhere slowly dissolving under exhaustion and vulnerability. Claire studied him quietly. It was strange seeing Ethan without the usual distance in his eyes. For years he had moved through life like someone always preparing for impact, always anticipating pressure, always protecting himself before anyone else had the chance to disappoint him. But tonight, sitting trapped between floors during a storm, there was nowhere left for him to hide emotionally. And somehow that made him feel closer to her than he had in months. Ethan slowly turned toward her. "Can I tell you something honestly?" Claire nodded softly. "I think I have spent most of my adult life confusing being needed with being loved." Claire's expression softened immediately. Ethan looked down at his hands while speaking quietly. "People need me because I solve problems. I provide security. I take responsibility." A faint sadness crossed his face. After a while you start believing your value only exists in what you can manage for other people. Claire listened carefully while rain crashed against the tower above them. Ethan continued softly. "That is probably why I panic whenever something feels emotionally uncertain." He gave a humorless smile. "I know how to fix business crises. I know how to negotiate contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars." Then he looked at her directly. "But the idea of losing you terrifies me because I cannot control it." Claire's eyes lowered slightly. Hearing him admit fear so openly felt almost surreal. Ethan had always seemed emotionally untouchable before tonight. Not cruel, just unreachable. "You know what hurt me most?" Claire whispered softly. Ethan stayed silent, letting her continue. "It was not the canceled dinners or the late nights at work." She looked toward the elevator doors thoughtfully. "It was watching you slowly stop sharing yourself with me." Ethan frowned slightly. Claire folded her hands together in her lap. "You used to tell me everything. Your stress, your doubts, your ideas." Her voice softened. "Lately it felt like you only showed me the polished version of yourself." Ethan looked away immediately because she was right. Somewhere along the way he had started treating emotional vulnerability like weakness instead of intimacy. Claire turned toward him fully now. "I never needed perfection from you." Ethan met her eyes again quietly. "Then what did you need?" Claire answered without hesitation this time. "Honesty." The simplicity of that word settled heavily between them. Ethan stared at her silently while thunder rolled somewhere high above the tower again. Claire continued softly. "I needed to know that behind the successful businessman and the schedules and the control," her voice trembled slightly, "there was still a real person willing to let me stand beside him emotionally." Ethan felt something tighten painfully inside his chest hearing that. Because suddenly he understood the difference between physical presence and emotional presence. He had spent months beside her without truly letting her reach him anymore. The elevator suddenly hummed beneath them. Both of them instinctively looked upward as the lights flickered brighter for a second. Then a crackling voice finally echoed through the emergency speaker overhead. "Mr. Calloway? Can you hear us?" Ethan immediately stood up. "Yes." Relief spread briefly across his face. "We are here." The engineer's voice sounded distorted through static. "We are resetting the backup systems now. The lift should resume shortly." "How long?" "Approximately 5 minutes, sir." Ethan nodded, even though the staff member could not see him. "Understood." The speaker went silent again. Claire slowly stood beside him, adjusting Ethan's jacket around her shoulders. For a brief moment, neither spoke. The realization hit both of them quietly at the same time. Their forced isolation was ending. And strangely, neither of them seemed ready for it. Ethan looked at her carefully. "I do not want a night to disappear once those doors open." Claire's expression softened painfully. "Then do not let it." Ethan swallowed slowly. "I mean it." His voice became quieter now, more vulnerable than she had ever heard before. "I do not want to go back to pretending everything is fine while you slowly feel more alone beside me." Claire looked down briefly. I do not want that either. Another mechanical sound echoed through the elevator shaft above them. The system was rebooting now. Claire suddenly looked nervous again, though not because of the storm this time. Ethan noticed immediately. What is it? She hesitated before answering honestly. I am scared this version of you only exists because we got trapped in here. Ethan stared at her for several seconds after that. Then he stepped closer slowly until only inches separated them again. No, he said quietly. I think this is the version of me that existed before I buried him under work and pressure and control. Claire's eyes glistened slightly beneath the amber light. Ethan reached up carefully and brushed a loose strand of damp blonde hair behind her ear. The gesture felt different now. Not automatic. Intentional. Present. You once asked me what happened to the man who danced with you in that tiny kitchen in Paddington, he whispered softly. Claire's breath caught slightly. Ethan gave the faintest sad smile. I think he just got lost for a while. The elevator suddenly jolted back to life beneath their feet. Claire instinctively grabbed Ethan's arm again as the lights brightened fully overhead for the first time in nearly an hour. A soft mechanical hum returned around them while the lift slowly resumed descending through the tower. Floor numbers began lighting up again beside the doors. 41, 40, 39. Ethan looked at Claire quietly while the city moved beneath them once more. For the first time in a very long time, he was no longer thinking about meetings or investors or schedules waiting upstairs. He was only thinking about the woman standing beside him and how dangerously close he had come to losing her without even realizing it. Sometimes the most important conversations in life happen right before the world interrupts them again. The elevator continued descending smoothly through the hotel tower while soft mechanical hums echoed around Ethan and Claire. The emergency lights had fully returned to normal now, washing the small space in warm gold instead of dim amber. Yet neither of them moved apart. They stood close together in silence while rain streaked endlessly across the narrow glass panel beside the doors. 32 floors. 31. 30. The city slowly rose around them again as the lift carried them back toward reality. Ethan glanced sideways at Claire. She still wore his jacket around her shoulders, the dark fabric oversized against her slim frame. Her blonde hair had dried slightly now, falling softly around her face beneath the elevator lights. She looked tired, emotionally tired, but softer than earlier somehow, less guarded. Ethan realized with painful clarity how long it had been since he simply stood still and noticed her properly. Not the glamorous version of Claire Whitmore photographed at events or fashion campaigns. The real Claire. The woman who carried old fears quietly behind elegant smiles. The woman who still tried to make people feel comfortable even while hurting herself. The woman he almost lost emotionally because he became too distracted to see her loneliness growing beside him. The elevator reached the lower executive levels with a soft mechanical sound. Claire finally broke the silence quietly. What happens when those doors open? Ethan looked at her carefully. What do you mean? Claire folded her arms lightly beneath his jacket. Do we just go upstairs and pretend tonight fixed everything? Ethan answered immediately this time. No, his voice remained calm, but certain. Tonight did not fix anything. Claire looked slightly surprised by the honesty. Ethan continued softly. But I think it showed me what I was about to lose. The words settled deeply between them. Claire lowered her gaze briefly because hearing him admit that out loud made her chest ache in a completely different way now. The elevator slowed again as it neared the lobby floors. Ethan watched the glowing floor numbers descend beside the doors while something unfamiliar tightened in his chest. Fear. Not fear of failure. Not fear of investors or public embarrassment. Fear of emotional consequences. Real consequences. Because suddenly he understood that Claire had not been threatening to leave him dramatically. She had simply been slowly disappearing emotionally while he stayed too consumed by work to notice. And somehow that realization terrified him more than anything else. The elevator doors finally opened into a quiet executive corridor where several hotel staff members stood waiting anxiously. The chief engineer stepped forward immediately. Mr. Calloway, I sincerely apologize. We are still assessing the electrical failure caused by the storm. Ethan nodded calmly. Any injuries? No, sir. Good. His voice remained composed, but Claire noticed something different now. Usually Ethan would have launched directly into operational questions and instructions. Tonight his attention stayed partially with her, even while speaking to staff. The lower public levels are experiencing intermittent outages. The engineer continued nervously. We recommend avoiding the main lobby until systems stabilize. Ethan glanced toward Claire before answering. Understood. The engineer looked visibly relieved. Again, sir, we are extremely sorry. Ethan gave a short nod, and the staff quickly dispersed down the corridor. Silence returned around them except for distant thunder echoing through the building. Claire looked toward the nearby windows overlooking the harbor. Rain still crashed violently across the city outside, turning the streets below into shimmering rivers of reflected lights. Ethan stepped beside her quietly. Do you still need air? Claire smiled faintly. I think I needed honesty more. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly at that. They began walking slowly through the executive corridor together, neither rushing toward the penthouse anymore. The hotel around them felt strangely different now. Earlier the building had seemed luxurious and polished. Now it simply felt quiet, human. Somewhere nearby, staff moved through hallways carrying flashlights and radios while soft emergency lighting glowed across marble floors. The storm had stripped some of the perfection away from the hotel tonight. Somehow that felt symbolic. Claire paused near one of the enormous windows overlooking circular quay below. Ferries moved slowly through the rain-covered harbor while lightning illuminated the skyline in silver flashes. Ethan stopped beside her. Beautiful, Claire whispered softly. Ethan looked at her instead of the view. Yeah, Claire noticed and gave him a small tired smile. Then suddenly Ethan's phone began vibrating loudly in his pocket again. The sound immediately changed the atmosphere between them. Claire watched his expression shift instinctively toward tension. Responsibility returning. Pressure returning. Ethan slowly pulled the phone out. 17 missed calls. Emails flooding the screen. Market updates from Singapore. Messages from executives. Crisis reports from hotel management. His entire world demanding him back instantly. Claire quietly looked away toward the rain outside. Ethan stared at the screen for several long seconds. Then something unexpected happened. He turned the phone completely off. Claire looked at him in surprise. Ethan. He slipped the silent phone back into his pocket. The company will survive one night without me. Claire stared at him carefully because she knew how impossible that decision would have been for him even a few hours earlier. Ethan gave a faint, tired smile. Honestly, I think I needed to stop hearing everyone else's voice for a while. Claire's expression softened deeply at that. Thunder rolled again outside while the city lights shimmered through the storm beyond the glass. Ethan leaned one shoulder lightly against the window beside her. You asked me earlier when I was last happy. Claire nodded softly. Ethan looked out toward the harbor quietly before answering. I think maybe I stopped recognizing happiness once my life became entirely about achievement. Claire listened silently. Ethan's voice lowered further. But sitting on the floor of that elevator with you, he glanced toward her, felt more real than anything I have experienced in months. Claire's breath caught slightly at the honesty in his words. Ethan looked away again, almost embarrassed by his own vulnerability now. That probably sounds pathetic. No, Claire whispered softly. It sounds human. Ethan closed his eyes briefly at that word. Human. Maybe that was what he had been missing all along beneath the pressure and control and endless pursuit of perfection. Not success, not admiration. Humanity. And standing there beside Claire while rain washed across the Sydney skyline outside, Ethan Calloway quietly realized he no longer wanted to be the strongest man in every room anymore. He just wanted to become someone capable of loving without turning it into another thing to manage. Some people spend their entire lives chasing success because they believe one day it will finally make them feel worthy of being loved. But love was never asking them to prove anything in the first place. The executive corridor remained quiet around Ethan and Claire while the storm continued pouring across Sydney outside the towering glass windows. Somewhere deeper inside the hotel, staff members moved quickly through hallways restoring systems and reassuring guests. But up here the world felt strangely still. Ethan stood beside Claire near the window overlooking the harbor, both of them wrapped in silence that no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt thoughtful now, careful. Like two people standing in the fragile space between heartbreak and healing. Claire watched the rain sliding down the glass slowly. Do you know what I used to envy about normal couples? She asked softly. Ethan turned toward her. What? A faint smile touched her lips. The little things. She glanced down toward the streets below where headlights shimmered through puddles and wet pavement. People grabbing takeaway together after work. Falling asleep on the couch during movies. Grocery shopping on Sunday mornings. Ethan listened quietly. Claire folded her arms lightly beneath his jacket. Everything with us became so big eventually. Her voice softened. Private events. Luxury holidays. Business dinners. She looked at him carefully. Sometimes I missed being ordinary with you. Ethan lowered his gaze slightly because every word reached somewhere painfully honest inside him. He had spent years believing love meant giving Claire a bigger life. A safer life. A more beautiful life. Meanwhile, she had simply wanted moments that felt real instead of impressive. Ethan leaned lightly against the window beside her. I do not even remember the last normal thing I did. Claire smiled sadly. That is kind of the problem. He let out a quiet breath through his nose. I built my entire life around never slowing down. Claire looked at him gently. And what did it cost you? Ethan stared out toward the harbor without answering immediately. Finally, he spoke quietly. Peace. The single word lingered heavily between them. Rain continued crashing softly against the tower while lightning flickered somewhere beyond the skyline. Ethan rubbed one hand slowly across the back of his neck, exhausted in a way he could no longer hide. I used to think if I worked hard enough, eventually everything would feel secure. Claire listened silently. But success just made people expect more from me. His expression darkened slightly with honesty. And after a while I started expecting more from myself too. Claire watched him carefully. You never let yourself rest, did you? Ethan gave a faint, humorless smile. Rest feels dangerous when you are terrified of losing everything. Claire's eyes softened deeply at that, because for the first time she fully understood something important about him. Ethan's control was never about arrogance. It was fear disguised as discipline. Fear of failure. Fear of disappointing people. Fear of becoming emotionally dependent on something fragile enough to disappear. Claire slowly stepped closer beside him. You know what is sad? Ethan glanced toward her. You spent years protecting everyone around you. Her voice lowered gently. But nobody ever taught you how to feel safe yourself. Ethan looked down immediately after that sentence because it hit too close to the truth. Neither spoke for several moments afterward. The storm outside softened slightly now, though rain still washed endlessly across the city. Ethan could feel something changing quietly inside him tonight. Not dramatically, not instantly. More like old emotional walls beginning to crack after years of pressure behind them. Claire suddenly reached for his hand gently. Ethan looked surprised by the gesture. What? She whispered softly. Ethan shook his head slightly. Nothing. But his voice sounded rougher now. Claire studied him carefully. You look emotional. Ethan laughed quietly under his breath. That sentence alone would probably terrify half my board members. Claire smiled faintly. Then Ethan surprised both of them by stepping closer and wrapping his arms around her slowly. Not rushed. Not automatic. Intentional. Claire froze softly against him for half a second because something about this embrace felt completely different from before. Usually Ethan held her protectively, almost possessively sometimes. Tonight he held her like a man finally admitting he needed comfort too. Claire rested her cheek lightly against his chest while rain whispered against the glass around them. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, breathing her in quietly. For months, he had felt emotionally disconnected from everything around him without understanding why. Yet somehow standing here with Claire in silence felt more grounding than any success he had achieved in years. I am sorry, he whispered finally. Claire looked up slightly. Ethan's voice stayed low and honest. Not because we argued tonight. His arms tightened gently around her. I am sorry because I stopped showing up emotionally and expected you to survive on effort instead of connection. Claire's eyes filled softly at the vulnerability in his words. Ethan lowered his forehead lightly against hers. You kept trying to reach me while I buried myself in work and routines because it felt easier than being emotionally exposed. His voice cracked faintly for the first time. And I hate that I made you feel alone because of that. Claire swallowed hard, her heart aching hearing the sincerity in every word. Ethan had apologized before in their relationship, but never like this. Never without defensiveness. Never without trying to immediately fix things afterward. This apology felt raw, human. I never wanted perfection from you. Claire whispered again softly. Ethan nodded once. I know that now. She looked into his eyes carefully. I just wanted the real version of you. Ethan's expression softened painfully. I think I forgot how to be him for a while. Thunder rolled faintly outside while the city lights shimmered across the wet harbor below them. Claire gently touched his face, her fingers warm against the exhaustion he carried so openly now. Then maybe this is where you remember. Ethan stared at her silently after that. Because deep down, for the first time in years, he finally understood something simple and terrifying at the same time. Love was never asking him to become more successful. It was asking him to become more honest. Rain has a strange way of making people honest. Maybe because storms remind human beings that no matter how powerful they become, there are still things in life they cannot control. Ethan and Claire remained standing beside the towering glass windows overlooking Sydney Harbor while the storm slowly softened outside. The rain no longer slammed violently against the hotel now. Instead, it drifted steadily across the city in silver sheets beneath the glowing skyline. Somewhere below them, ferries moved quietly through dark water while traffic lights reflected across wet streets like scattered pieces of gold. The world outside continued moving forward. But inside the quiet executive corridor, time still felt suspended between them somehow. Claire rested against the window lightly, Ethan's jacket wrapped around her shoulders while warmth from his embrace still lingered against her skin. Ethan stood beside her silently, one hand in his pocket now, the other resting loosely against the marble ledge beneath the glass. He looked calmer than earlier, but also more exposed, like someone who had finally stopped performing strength for the first time in years. Claire glanced toward him softly. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan let out a quiet breath. "Honestly," she nodded. His eyes lowered briefly. "I am thinking about how close I came to losing you without noticing it." Claire's chest tightened slightly, hearing the raw honesty in his voice. Ethan continued quietly. Not physically. His jaw shifted subtly as he searched for the right words. Emotionally, he looked toward the rain outside. "You were slowly disappearing beside me, and I kept assuming love would survive on autopilot." Claire watched him carefully. Ethan gave a faint, humorless laugh under his breath. "Turns out relationships are not businesses. You cannot neglect them for months and expect them to stay healthy, because the foundation used to be strong." Claire smiled sadly at that. "No." Ethan looked at her then. "And I think I forgot that people do not need perfect partners." His voice softened deeply. "They need emotionally available ones." Silence settled gently around them after that. Somewhere farther down the corridor, staff members continued speaking quietly through radios while emergency crews stabilized the hotel systems floor by floor. But the noise felt distant now, unimportant. Claire stepped slightly closer beside Ethan again. "I need you to understand something." Ethan turned fully toward her. Tonight mattered. Her voice trembled softly beneath the quiet storm outside. "Not because we suddenly fixed everything." She shook her head gently. "But because for the first time in a very long time, I felt like you actually let me see you again." Ethan stared at her silently. Claire continued softly. "The real you." Ethan's expression shifted slightly at those words. Vulnerability still looked unfamiliar on him, like clothing he had forgotten how to wear comfortably. "I am not very good at this," he admitted quietly. Claire smiled faintly. "Neither am I." Ethan lowered his gaze for a moment before speaking again. "I spent years believing love meant protecting people from discomfort." His eyes met hers carefully. "But tonight made me realize avoiding emotional honesty only creates different kinds of pain." Claire's eyes softened deeply. Ethan took another slow breath. "I do not want to become someone who only knows how to provide materially." He glanced around the luxury corridor briefly. "I already mastered that version of life." Then he looked back at her. "And honestly, it feels empty without emotional connection." Claire felt tears sting softly behind her eyes hearing that. Because for months she had prayed silently for him to finally understand what she could never fully explain to him before tonight. Ethan stepped closer until only inches separated them now. "I know trust does not rebuild overnight," he said quietly. "And I know one emotional conversation does not erase months of distance." Claire listened silently while rain shimmered behind them across the harbor lights. Ethan's voice lowered further. "But I want to learn how to love you in a healthier way." Her breath caught slightly. Ethan swallowed hard before continuing. "Not by controlling everything around us." His eyes softened painfully. "By actually being emotionally present with you." Claire stared at him for several long seconds because she could hear something different in his voice now. No polished confidence. No rehearsed charm. Just sincerity. Raw and imperfect. That scares you, does it not? She whispered softly. Ethan laughed quietly once beneath his breath. Terrifies me. Claire smiled faintly through the emotion gathering in her chest. Ethan looked almost relieved admitting that aloud. But losing you scares me more. The honesty of that sentence lingered heavily between them. Claire slowly reached for his hand again. Ethan intertwined his fingers with hers immediately this time, naturally, without hesitation. The gesture felt small, simple, yet somehow more intimate than every extravagant gesture he had ever given her before. Claire looked down briefly at their hands together. You know something? Ethan watched her carefully. I do not need you to become perfect emotionally. Her voice remained gentle and steady. I just need to know you are willing to stop hiding behind control whenever things feel vulnerable. Ethan nodded slowly. I think tonight broke something open inside me. Claire looked at him softly. Good. Ethan smiled faintly at that. Real this time. Not polished. Not strategic. Human. The storm outside finally began easing further now, rain softening against the city skyline, while distant thunder faded into the horizon. Ethan looked out across the harbor quietly before speaking again. Tomorrow morning my board expects me on 3 different conference calls. Claire gave him a playful, tired look. That sounds horrifying. Ethan laughed softly under his breath. Usually I would already be mentally preparing for them. He turned toward her. But right now I honestly do not care. Claire stared at him in surprise. Ethan shrugged lightly. The company survived tonight. Then his voice lowered gently. I almost lost something far more important. Claire's eyes glistened slightly again, hearing those words. Ethan slowly lifted her hand and pressed it softly against his chest. His heartbeat was steady beneath her palm now. Calm. Present. I spent years building hotels designed to make strangers feel welcome, he whispered quietly. Meanwhile, the woman I love was starting to feel emotionally alone beside me. His eyes held hers fully. I do not ever want that to happen again. Claire swallowed hard against the emotion rising inside her. Because for the first time in months, she finally believed him. 3 months later, Sydney looked different to Ethan Calloway. Not because the city had changed. Because he was finally learning to live inside it instead of standing above it. Rain drifted softly across the harbor again on a quiet Thursday evening, turning the windows of the Calloway Grand Hotel into sheets of silver. The storm was nothing like the one that trapped him and Claire inside the elevator, but every time rain touched the glass now, Ethan remembered that night with painful clarity. Not as the night he magically became a better man. He knew better than that now. It was the night he finally stopped pretending he did not need to become one. Change had not been dramatic. That was the part nobody saw from the outside. No grand announcement. No magazine interview about personal growth. No expensive apology disguised as romance. It had been smaller than that, and therefore harder. It was Ethan turning his phone off at dinner and feeling panic rise in his chest for 20 minutes before it passed. It was him sitting in a therapist's office on Tuesday mornings, jaw tight, learning to name feelings he had spent years converting into strategy. It was Claire telling him, gently but firmly, that one vulnerable night in an elevator did not erase months of loneliness. And it was Ethan listening without defending himself. The first few weeks had not been easy. Twice, he slipped back into old patterns. Once, he scheduled a private weekend away without asking whether Claire even wanted to go. Another time, during a tense board crisis, he answered emails through nearly an entire dinner before realizing Claire had gone quiet across from him. The old Ethan would have apologized quickly and expected the apology to fix the damage. The new Ethan set the phone down, admitted the truth, and said, I am doing it again, aren't I? Claire had looked at him for a long moment that night. Then she nodded. Yes. That single word hurt more than anger, but it also saved him from pretending. Now, 3 months later, Ethan stood near the lobby windows without a tie, sleeves rolled neatly past his wrists while guests moved behind him beneath crystal chandeliers. The hotel still looked beautiful, still expensive, still impressive, but it no longer felt like proof of his worth. It was only a building. A successful one, yes, but still just glass, marble, lights, and people trying to get through their own storms. His phone buzzed quietly in his pocket. Ethan glanced at the screen. Singapore. Again. 3 months ago, he would have answered before the second vibration. Tonight, he silenced it and looked toward the revolving doors instead. A few seconds later, Claire stepped inside from the rain. She wore a cream wool coat, her blonde hair damp at the ends, her umbrella folded loosely in one hand. She was not smiling brightly. That mattered to Ethan now. He no longer needed every moment between them to look healed in order to believe healing was happening. Claire looked tired from work. Real. Human. Beautiful in the way honesty was beautiful when someone stopped performing happiness for survival. Ethan walked toward her. You made it. Claire raised an eyebrow. That sounds like you expected me to run. I prepared emotionally for both possibilities. She stared at him for half a second, then laughed softly. Not the polite laugh she used to give him when he said something polished at the wrong time. A real laugh. Small, surprised, alive. Ethan smiled because he had learned not to reach for too much too quickly. Joy was not something to grab. It was something to be grateful for when it came back. He took the umbrella from her hand. Still hate lifts. Only the ones that turn into emotional group therapy. Fair. Instead of leading her toward the private elevator, Ethan guided her through a quieter hallway near the harborside restaurant. Claire noticed immediately that there were no roses covering every surface. No photographers. No string quartet. No staff waiting nervously for instructions. Just a small table beside the rain-covered window, 2 cups of coffee, and a plate of slightly uneven toast. Claire stopped walking. Toast. Ethan looked almost embarrassed. You said you missed ordinary things. She looked at the table again. Butter. Jam. 2 chipped ceramic mugs that definitely did not belong in a 5-star hotel dining room. One of them had tiny yellow stars painted across the side. Claire's expression shifted. Is that from the old apartment? Ethan nodded slowly. I found it in storage. She touched the mug carefully, as if the memory inside it might break. You kept this. I kept a lot of things I did not know how to understand at the time. The honesty landed quietly between them. Claire sat down first. Ethan waited before taking the chair across from her, not because he was performing gentlemanly manners, but because he had learned to slow down long enough to notice whether she seemed comfortable. For a few minutes, they ate in silence while rain blurred the harbor lights beyond the glass. It was not a cinematic silence. It was the ordinary kind. The kind that did not need to be filled because neither person was running from it. Claire finally looked at him. How was therapy? Ethan took a breath. 3 months ago, the question would have made him defensive. Tonight, it made him nervous, which was more honest. Uncomfortable, he admitted. Apparently, I use productivity as emotional armor. Claire smiled faintly. That sounds accurate. He also said I keep trying to earn love by being useful. Her smile softened. And what do you think? Ethan looked down at the chipped mug between his hands. I think he is right. He paused. I think when my father died, everyone needed me to become strong so quickly that I confused strength with never needing anything. Then I built a whole life around being admired because admiration felt safer than intimacy. Claire stayed quiet, but her eyes glistened slightly. Ethan continued, voice low. But being admired did not make me less lonely. It just made the loneliness look successful. Rain tapped gently against the window. Somewhere in the restaurant, a waiter laughed softly with another staff member. Ethan noticed it and, for once, did not feel the need to control the atmosphere around him. Claire reached across the table, not dramatically, just enough for her fingers to rest near his. I need to say something too. Ethan nodded. Okay. I am proud of you. The words hit him harder than he expected. His throat tightened before he could prepare for it. But, Claire added softly, I am still learning to trust the change. Ethan nodded again, slower this time. I know. I do not want us to pretend the storm fixed everything. It did not. And I do not want a perfect version of you for 3 months that disappears the moment life becomes difficult again. Ethan looked at her fully. You should not have to want that. You should be able to expect consistency. Claire studied him carefully, and something in her face softened because he had not argued. He had not rushed to reassure her. He had simply accepted the truth. That, she whispered, is different. Ethan let out a quiet breath he had not realized he was holding. I am trying. I know. The simplicity of her answer nearly broke him. Because for years he had wanted to be praised for winning, building, providing, achieving. But sitting across from Claire with rain falling outside and toast crumbs on a hotel plate, he discovered something far more humbling. Being seen while trying was more intimate than being admired after succeeding. His phone vibrated again. This time both of them looked at his pocket. Ethan pulled it out slowly. Singapore again. Then Harrison from the board. Then another message marked urgent. The old tension rose in his shoulders automatically. Claire saw it. Ethan knew she saw it. For 1 second, the old life opened its door. He could step through it easily. He knew that room. Crisis. Control. Importance. The comfortable addiction of being needed by everyone except the person sitting right in front of him. Ethan turned the phone face down on the table. Then he hesitated. Claire watched him carefully. He picked it up again. Her face changed for half a second before he spoke. "I am going to send one message," he said quietly. "Not disappear into it." Claire nodded once. "Okay." Ethan typed slowly. "Handle without me unless there is an actual safety issue. I am unavailable tonight." He sent it, turned the phone off completely, then placed it beside the chipped Yellow Star mug like an offering to a different kind of life. Claire looked at the phone, then at him. "You know they may be annoyed." "I know. That still bothers you." "Terribly." She smiled softly. Ethan smiled back, then reached across the table. This time Claire placed her hand in his without hesitation. The gesture was small. No music swelled. No one applauded. No headline would ever be written about it. But to Ethan, it felt larger than every hotel opening he had ever attended. Because love, he had learned, was not proved by how much a man could give when things were easy. It was proved by what he was willing to unlearn when his old habits were hurting someone. Claire looked out at the rain. "Do you remember what I said that night? You said a lot of devastatingly accurate things." She laughed softly. "I said I was afraid one day I would stop missing you." Ethan's expression sobered. "I remember." She turned back to him, eyes warm but honest. "I missed you this week." The sentence was so simple that for a moment Ethan could not speak. It was not forgiveness wrapped in dramatic music. It was not a promise that nothing would ever hurt again. It was better than that. It was evidence that something real had survived. He lifted her hand gently and pressed his lips to her knuckles. "I missed you too." Outside, the rain softened over Sydney Harbor. The city lights shimmered against the glass, beautiful but no longer intimidating. Ethan looked around the quiet restaurant. The imperfect toast, the chipped mugs, the woman across from him who had stayed long enough to tell him the truth, and the life he was finally learning not to manage but to feel. For the first time in years, Ethan Calloway did not feel powerful. He felt present. And that, he finally understood, was the real luxury. Not the penthouse. Not the skyline. Not the money. Not the admiration of strangers. Real luxury was sitting across from someone who had seen the parts of you that were hardest to love and still finding the courage to build something honest together, one ordinary evening at a time.